In the summer of 2003, I began filming the series Atheism, A Rough History of Disbelief. As part of the process, I talked to a number of writers, scientists, historians, and philosophers. Having secured their cooperation, I was very embarrassed to find that a large proportion of what went on ended up on the cutting room floor, simply because the series would have lasted 24 hours otherwise. Well, as it happens, the BBC agreed with me that the conversations were too interesting to be junked, and with these 6 supplementary programmes, they've made the extremely unusual decision to go back to the original material and to broadcast at length some of the conversations which I had. Conversations with people such as the English biologist Richard Dawkins, the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, the Cambridge theologian Dэнnis Tёrnер, the American playwright Arthur Miller, the English philosopher Colin MacGinn, and the American Nobel Prize-winning physicist Stiven Weinberg. When I talked to the English philosopher Colin MacGinn at his apartment in New York, we discussed at some length the meaning of the word belief, and much of that discussion is in the Atheism series. But to begin with, I just wanted to get from Colin a sense of what it felt like to be a sceptical English philosopher in a country as seemingly religious as the United States.
Sometimes Americans will say, so you don't believe in God? And I say, that's right, I don't believe in God. And they say, so do you believe in anything?
Oh, yes.
Do you believe in anything? And I say, I believe in many things, and I don't make jokes to them about I believe in tables and chairs. And I say to them, you know, I believe in various ethical causes and political ideas and other aesthetic values, intellectual values, lots of things that I believe in. And they say, that's all you believe in. I said, that's all I believe in. Don't you believe in something God-like? You don't believe in the traditional God. Don't you believe there's something there? And I say, no, there's nothing there. And it's very difficult to get across to people who are religious, when you're an atheist, you mean you don't believe in anything like that whatsoever. It's not that you think nature is God, or it doesn't have personal qualities, or something like that. You don't believe in anything of that type. Nothing supernatural, nothing miraculous, nothing superstitious, no ghosts, no telepathy, nothing of that kind. That's what it's to do with. It's not that I'm picking on God, somehow, or picking on the Christian God and not believing in him. It's just nothing of that type. And that's
well, but don't you then get the answer which I get from people who are not necessarily religious? I mean, they don't belong to either or any of the 3 monotheistic religions. They will say, not just simply, there must be something, to which I would give the same reply as you, but where do you get your spirituality?
Yeah,
it sounds as if otherwise there's a shortage of some sort, but I've never been able to get from them whether it's like some vitamin deficiency.
Exactly. What do they mean by that? Spiritual. Can an atheist be spiritual? I guess it's a matter of definition, really. I mean, it certainly can't be if it connotes anything supernatural, but aesthetic and ethical values can approximate to what people call the spirit. Your most deeply held beliefs about human behaviour might be counted as spiritual, I don't know. Your feelings about nature, I suppose, might be. I mean, I wouldn't use the word. It doesn't seem to me to be a good word to use, a risky word to use, but it doesn't mean you don't have any deep views about things, or deep convictions about things.
Well,
but
that's
often
where
people feel
I always say the clergyman crouching in the laurel bushes leaps out and says, your deep feelings are, in fact, unacknowledged acknowledgements of the God you deny.
Yeah, well, one of my deep feelings is that there is no God, and it's a bad idea to believe in God, and it's been very harmful. So if that reflects my belief in God, well, that's a strange situation. That's one of my deepest convictions, is there is no God.
Now, I happen to share Colin's conviction that there is no God. And in my case, I never believed it. So I wondered if there had ever been a time in Colin's earlier life when he did believe in God.
Well, with me, it was actually quite precisely delineated. It was, I can't remember the exact dates now, the exact times, but I think I was about 17 or 18 when the idea of believing in God, and it was Christianity that I was exposed to, became real to me. And it went on for about a year, I would say. Not much more than that. If you'd said to me when I was 10, do you believe in God? I probably would have said yes, I don't know. But it didn't mean anything. It was just sort of, everybody does, don't they? I mean, like the cows, everybody believes in them, right? So it went, but then I actually started studying the Bible because I was studying Divinity A-level. So I started studying it, but we had a very charismatic teacher, an admirable man, Mr. Marsh, who I wrote about in my autobiography, who was very enthusiastic, and he was teaching us the Bible, and I was having to learn the Bible, studying it closely, it's like Old Testament, New Testament. So I know much more about the New Testament than most Christians now, and even now, 25 years later, I know more about it than most religious people. So I actually know it pretty well. It's what got me interested in philosophy. So at the same time I was getting interested in philosophy, it was through thinking about religion, studying the Bible. And I think there were two factors, a confluence of two factors here. One was the interest in metaphysical questions, basic questions about the universe. What's it all about? What does it all mean? That kind of question. And on the other hand, there was an ethical component to it, because you find in the New Testament, obviously, a very strong emphasis on ethical aspects of life. I was an idealistic teenager, and it was in the 60s, so that had a profound impact on me, the ethical side. And I was not brought up in a house where ethical ideas were particularly discussed and it still has a profound impact on me, the ethical side of it. So those two things, I think, made me think there was more to life than the mundane realities that I'd been used to, living up there in Blackpool, with the amusement arcades and the pubs and fish and chip shops, and the freezing cold. And there was this idea of philosophical thought, metaphysical ideas, and then these high ethical ideals. A good combination, right? A good combination. So I got interested in it, and so for a period I was influenced by that. And I went to university studying psychology. And since I stopped studying the Bible, I wasn't seeing Mr. Marsh anymore for our divinity lessons. I kept it up a bit, and then occasionally would talk to people about religion, and it just sort of disappeared. And I remember going out, sort of trying hard to keep up with it, going to some sort of religious meeting, and I just was sitting and listening. I thought, this is a load of rubbish. I just don't think this is true anymore. And then I was reading Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian, and in I don't remember the details, but in a pretty short time I just decided it was all wrong. And I also decided you could keep the ethical side and the philosophical side and jettison the rest. So Russell represented to me an alternative to religious idealism. It was a more, it was a secular idealism. So I realized you could have some of the aspects of religion which appealed to me, you could have without religion. And the bits that didn't appeal to me, like, the virgin birth, miracles, strange ideas about how the universe came around, the sort of bits it's very hard to believe, you could just cut those bits off and you could keep the good bits. So you get rid of the theological baggage of religion, and then you keep the sides of it that you like. And that's what I have done ever since. Basically the same thing.
Was there any crisis in, as it were, unhitching the metaphysical and divine from the ethical to which you continue to subscribe?
Not in my case, which is, I think it differs from other people's case. In Russell's own description of his fall from theism, he describes it as a deeply painful, traumatic, irrecoverable episode. He spent his whole life somehow dealing with it. Not with me. It was relatively easy. It just happened quite naturally. As I say in my autobiography, it's like shedding the skin when the skin comes off and you have a new skin and it seems fine.
Was there a sense of relief as you shed the skin?
No, I wouldn't say there was relief. I think there was disappointment.
Ah.
I would like religion to be true. I'd like it to be true, because I'd like there to be immortality. I'd like there to be rewards for those who've been virtuous and punishments for those who've not been virtuous. Especially the punishments would be good. There's no justice in this world, and it would be good if there was some cosmic force that distributed justice in the proper way that it should be. And it still is, to me, a constant source of irritation and pain that wicked people prosper and virtuous people don't. So there was a bit of disappointment about those aspects of it. But there was some exhilaration too. Russell has a description which I think is kind of appropriate of a feeling of a godless universe is a kind of exhilarating universe. There's something hygienic about it. There's something bracing about it. Whereas the idea that there's this sort of suffocating presence gazing at your every movement and thought, and gauging everything you do, and it's a bit oppressive to think that way.
Well, okay. Now here you are, the philosopher that you thought you might become.
Yeah.
You have now very fully become. Now, in your role as a philosopher, I'd love you to develop the arguments which were previously simply intuitional skin shedding.
Yeah.
Now be more systematic and surgical about it, and say why, in fact, the notion of a God is incredible.
The one set of arguments is the sort of no evidence arguments. Russell puts it by saying, there's no more reason to believe in the Christian God than the Greek gods. No more reason to believe. In other words, there's no positive evidence for it. There's no theory that you need to postulate God in to explain some natural phenomenon which can't be explained by some other theory. People sometimes will say, well, miracles were performed. There's never any good evidence that miracles were performed. The judgment that they were is usually based on a prior opinion that God exists rather than being an independent source for believing that God exists. So there's no evidence in terms of what anybody's ever observed. There's no fact about the world that can't be explained without postulating God. So there's no reason to believe in God, any more than there's any reason to believe in Zeus or any of the Greek gods. So that's on the side of whether there's any reason to believe it. There's the question now, are there reasons to disbelieve it? Are there any positive arguments against it? There are also some arguments for, like the ontological argument. When we talk about the ontological argument.
Well, tell us what that argument is.
The ontological argument. This is a very nice argument. Anselm of Canterbury thought of it. I think it must be in the 15th century. He argued that the definition of God entails that God exists. Now, this would be a fantastic result, right, if that... Just the mere definition tells that God exists. So, what's the definition of God? The most perfect conceivable being, or let's say the most powerful conceivable being is an equally good way of putting it. And then Anselm argues as follows. Well, suppose this most powerful or most perfect being did not exist, right? Then he would lack the attribute of existence. But the attribute of existence is one of the perfections, or one of the things which makes a being powerful. But since he is by definition the most perfect being, he must have the attribute of existence. Therefore, God exists. Right, so let's go over the argument again. Yes. Get the definition of God. How is God to be defined? Let's compare this with the unicorn. Well, how is a unicorn to be defined? A unicorn is a horse with a horn growing out of the middle of its head. There's nothing in that definition to imply that unicorns exist, and unicorns don't exist. But let's define God, right? An all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing being. Right? These are some of his characteristics. And everybody will agree that's the definition of God. So now one of the definitions is he's the most perfect being. One of his attributes is utmost perfection, unimprovable perfection. Okay, that's the definition of God. Now Anselm argues, but if God didn't exist, wouldn't he be less perfect than a being just like him in all those attributes, except that that being existed? Because to exist is to be more perfect than not to exist. It's better to exist than not to exist. God is as good as you can be, as superior as you can be, so he must exist. So we know by definition that God exists. It's a brilliant argument, right? But it's wholly unconvincing to everybody who hears it. They think there's something going wrong with that, That's a very strange argument.
All right, tell us what's wrong with it.
The difficulty is nobody's ever managed to pinpoint exactly what's wrong with it. I'll tell you what I think is wrong with it, though the issue is not by no means clear. I think what's very funny in the bit that strikes you as sophistical is the bit that says, God's the most perfect. Existence is one of the perfections. It sounds superficially plausible, but what does it really mean, right? It's one of the perfections. I like to compare this to somebody who said, let's take the most tasty meal conceivable. The most tasty meal conceivable. Does that mean anything to say that? This is the most tasty meal I've ever had, but it's not well defined, the most tasty meal conceivable, or the best football game conceivable. Not that I've ever seen. What does it mean? I mean, it's not a very clearly meaningful idea. So if we say we're defining God as the most perfect being, and we don't really lay down very clearly what we mean by perfect, then what does it really mean, the most perfect being? He doesn't have the most perfect colours, because he's not coloured at all. What is it? It's not clear what it means. So we can't always think that phrases like the most perfect conceivable F are always meaningful. Sometimes they are meaningful. The most perfect conceivable triangle It means one whose angles are precisely 180 degrees. But the most perfect conceivable moral being, what does that mean? It's not clear that it's so well defined. So that's what I think is wrong with it. But it's like many a philosophical argument. Just because you can't refute it, it doesn't mean you should take it all that seriously, especially if, form your common sense beliefs on the basis of it.
All right, so much for the ontological.
Yes, right, that's the ontological argument.
Now, how about the other ones?
Well, here's one I like. People think, I think this psychologically, this is quite important to people. That's why this argument is probably more important psychologically. People think, without God, life is meaningless. Where is meaning? Right? It's just an empty charade of, pointless and purposeless, valueless, going from one thing to the next. Well, the first reply to make to that is you don't necessarily need to seek the meaning of life outside of life. Here's the premise, the assumption of that argument. Without there being a being outside of human life would have no meaning. So the meaning of human life must be conferred by another being. Here's my question. What gives the meaning to that being's life? Right? How does his life, God's life, derive meaning? Well, here's a dilemma, right? Either God's life has meaning intrinsically just by his existence, or not, right? Well, if it does, then it's possible to have a meaningful life intrinsically. So why can't our lives have intrinsic meaning? They don't need to have their meaning conferred by another being.
But the religious might want to argue, without even reverting to the ontological proof for the existence of God, that the observable fact that we do have values and meanings is in fact evidence of the fact that something has given the meanings, in the same way that the argument from design says something has given the thing design.
Yeah. Well, I think there are 2 points there. One point is that the existence of values itself is an argument for the existence of God, like an evidence argument. Another point, though, altogether, is the idea that morality can only have a foundation if it's based on God's commands or God's desires, God's wishes. Right, now, you started with the first one, of course. The thing to say about that is there's just no reason to think that the existence of values in human society depends on the existence of God. I mean, why should it? There's just no clear logical argument for one thing. Any more than the existence of ears, is a reason. I mean, there are various aspects of human life. There's art, there's value, there's family, there's all sorts of things that we take to be valuable. Why does any of these require that we postulate God to explain their existence? A more worrying question for many people is they don't see that morality can have any foundation, can have any absoluteness, unless there's a God to certify it, legitimate it. You can see that point. It's a point that was discussed by Plato long ago in the Euthyphro argument. And he makes, what I think Socrates makes, a completely compelling case, refutation of that argument. And it simply goes as follows. The argument, you see, goes like this. Suppose you take as a moral principle, it's wrong to steal. People say, now, why is that wrong? Why is it wrong to steal? Answer, because God says it's wrong to steal. God commanded that you should not steal. Okay. The point that Socrates makes in that dialogue is to say, well, how can God give this moral rule a foundation? Either the moral rule is itself intrinsically a sound moral rule, or it can't be given soundness and legitimacy from an external command. Suppose, for example, we had the rule, it's right to murder. And somebody said, that's not right. Murder is wrong. And somebody said in reply, but God says it's right to murder. That doesn't convince you that it's right to murder. If God says that something is right which isn't right, God's wrong. Right? He can't make something right just by saying it's right. What God has to do is reflect what's right in his commandments. So that's what he really does. It is wrong to steal, wrong to steal and wrong to murder. So God says that it's wrong. And he's right to say that. Why? Because it is wrong in the two cases. He doesn't make it wrong by saying it. He can't do that. If that was so, we'd have no reason to respect God's morality.
In that case, God, as it were, appropriates our spontaneous and indigenous values, which then get, as it were, reflected back upon this hypothetical entity,
that's right.
Which then seems to validate our beliefs.
Exactly. So we don't need God to validate our moral beliefs. He couldn't validate them. His validations only work in as much as they correspond to what is morally right and is morally wrong. He can't make something be morally right when it's not. Another way to put it is, it can't be a matter of God's free decision or whim what's right and wrong. people can see that morality is what it is. They know what they ought to do. But human beings are weak. We're weak. We have weakness of the will. We don't always do what we know very well we ought to do. And that is, in most people, produces the phenomenon of guilt. Guilt is a powerful negative force in people's minds. People hate guilt. Right? Guilt is a bad feeling. So you need something to prevent guilt. To prevent guilt, you need something to make you do what you know is right. But since human beings are weak, they don't always do what they know is right. But God gives you an extra motive to do what's right, beyond morality itself. Morality gives you a motive, but it's a motive which is rather fragile, rather, momentary, intermittent, and easily broken. But if you've got the idea of God there, it can sort of give it some more oomph, gives it more power. And then you can do what you know is right more easily, more regularly, and that's, perfectly sensible. That's why, it's reasonable, it's not unreasonable anyway for an atheist to think that maybe we need God, or people need God, because without God they can't do what they know is right. And I don't believe that myself. I think people are not as morally depraved as the religious tradition says. I think most people will do what's right in normal conditions. They won't always, of course, but normally they will. They don't need God. And I think people who sometimes have lived with God as their moral support, their moral whatever it is that they're getting from it, when they cease to believe in God, they feel that it was not as difficult to be moral afterwards as they suspected it might be. And in fact, it was better, because there's a corrupting part to that conception of God, which is the idea that you're doing something good because God will reward you and think well of you. And that's a corrupting idea. It's much better to do what's good because it's good, and only because it's good. And that's your only reason for doing it. But the idea you're going to get the warm, fuzzy feeling, oh, God's really pleased with me today, I did this, that's not what morality ought to be about.
Having discussed the various arguments that have been offered in favour of the existence of God, I asked Colin to summarise some of the best reasons for not believing.
Well, the classic argument against is the problem of evil. This is, even religious people find this one very uncomfortable. So the argument is simply, God is meant to be a being who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. So how come there is suffering and pain in the world? Right? Why does God allow it? God, obviously, if he's all-good, thinks it's bad that this should occur, would rather it didn't occur, right? Like any decent person would rather it didn't occur, and yet he lets it occur. Now, that would be okay if he didn't have the power to change it, but he's meant to be all-powerful. We're told by religious people he intervenes all the time in various ways. So why doesn't he intervene to prevent the death of a child, or the torture of a prisoner? He doesn't do it. So you don't want to conclude from that, well, God is actually quite a bad person. That's a conceivable conclusion you might draw. But what you conclude from it is the combination of these two characteristics is inconsistent. He's all good and he's all powerful. You need all-knowing too, of course, because he has to know it's going on. But it's essentially the conflict between being all good and all powerful and the existence of evil. And the standard reply to that, the apologists of religion will give the reply, God created human beings with free will. Now, there's the question, why did he do that, knowing the results were going to be horrific? Right? That was a pretty wicked thing to do, to start with. But let's put that one aside. But the problem with that argument is not all of the suffering in the world comes from the exercise of human will. Much of it comes from human natural catastrophes or disease, accidents, all sorts of things can cause tremendous suffering in humans. Somebody's born with a genetic disease. No human being had any role whatsoever in creating that. That comes from nature, God's creation, of course, we're told. So God created a world in which it was inevitable there'd be tremendous suffering on the part of completely innocent human beings.
But there might be religious arguments to the effect that he created this obstacle course for his created creatures endowed with free will in order to bring out the best in them.
And I always find this one, to me, it brings out to me the sort of hard-hearted, immoral side of this way of thinking about things. Because just think about what's being said when somebody says that. You've got the innocent child with some terrible disease, and God's up there saying to himself, I really need to test some people here. They need to put the obstacle course needs to be put there. Let me pick on this little 2-year-old girl, put her through this terrible ordeal, and I'll test the other people. I mean, if any human being said to you that's what they'd done, suppose I decided, in my wisdom, I need to test some people here. I need to improve their moral characters. So I'm going to do this terrible thing to their child, you know. You'd think I was the wickedest person in the world to do that. Well, why isn't God? If that's what God does, I have no respect for him. I think that's a wicked thing to do. God shouldn't do that. If God cares about human beings, he should not allow that to happen.
Having discussed the arguments both for and against religion, we turned to speculation as to the reason why so many people still had a need to believe.
I don't think anybody has any very good ideas about why this is, especially why they believe in it to the extent that they do. What I would speculate about it is, I think it's less to do with the idea of death and survival of death and rewards in heaven and punishment in hell. I think it's a sort of cosmic loneliness. I think that's what's behind it. It's hard for people to accept that we are alone and that nobody cares outside of us. I think there's a kind of constitutive reason for that, which is human consciousness is essentially sealed off from other consciousnesses. Mine is sealed off from you. We only know each other indirectly through the symptoms of the body, and yet we yearn to be in contact with other people. Love is a lot to do with that. So we have this feeling that we are, as conscious embodied beings, somehow or other lonely in our essence, cut off in our essence. And that's a feeling which we struggle against. And you can see it in literature and so on, dealing with this theme. Frankenstein actually deals with it a lot. So we feel this sort of metaphysical, existential aloneness in the universe. And God is a wonderful antidote to that, because in the case of God, God, we feel, directly comes into our minds, and we're directly in contact with God. See, God doesn't know us through our bodies. God knows us intimately in our minds. And that satisfies a deep craving, I think, in the human soul, right, for communion with something outside the self.
I'd just like to finish with one thing. Here you are, like myself, reluctant to use the word atheist to describe what we are. It's an accusation rather than, as it were, a conviction. In a country which, in fact, has become more intensely religious, do you find it difficult to uphold such ideas in the America of the 21st century?
Let me say something about the first point, the label one has. Yeah, to be called an atheist, it's a negative view, and it suggests that one is a sort of professional atheist. You know, you spend your life arguing against God, which way Russell did. And I think that's a sort of an undignified and rather pointless procedure. Once you decide there isn't a God, you know, there's not much point in inveighing against it, unless you think huge harm is being done by the belief in God. But you don't, nobody spends their time trying to prove to others that the Greek gods don't exist. You just decide that they don't, and that's the end of the story for you. So I like to distinguish atheism from anti-theism. Anti-theism is opposition to theism. I am an anti-theist because I believe that religion is harmful in human life. So I am an anti-theist. I'm not just an atheist who my only values are that I don't agree with it. I'm actively opposed to it. But then I distinguish that from what I call post-theism or post-atheism, which is the healthy state of mind where you've put all that behind you. Now, we can't do that yet because there's lots of religion in the world and lots of bad results of it. But to me, the ideal society would be one in which the question of religion didn't really arise for people, or if it did, it wasn't a heavy question for them. They would say to each other, those humans used to believe back there in 2003. Some of them believed there was this God and he did this. Others didn't, and they did TV programs about why they didn't. What a funny debate that was, So it would be a post-theist society where it wasn't an issue.
Now, the Nobel Prize-winning American physicist Stiven Weinberg has often addressed himself to what he sees as the pernicious effects of religion. And when I met him in Texas, I started by asking him how he reacted to the fact that the physicists who were his own intellectual predecessors had seen the physical regularity of the universe and the beauty of the earth to be incontrovertible evidence of divine design.
Looking at nature in the past, the impression of design must have been overwhelming. I mean, It's such a comfortable, pleasant earth, and things work out so well. Well, as we learn more and more about the universe, it seems not such a friendly place, and we appear just to have been winners in a cosmic lottery.
And yet there might be those believers who might say, yes, admittedly, there are other celestial bodies which are not good stage sets for life, let alone for the human drama, but here we are on Earth, which is, as they would say, convivially arranged to accommodate.
Well, what would you expect? I mean, with all these billions and billions of planets, some of them are going to be comfortable, and it's only on those that life can arise.
But people like Newton, for example, and Samuel Clarke, who wrote, as it were, on his behalf later on at Trinity when he did the Boyle Lectures, was not invoking the comfort and conviviality of the Earth. Newton was impressed by the regularity of nature, whether or not it was a suitable setting for the human drama. He thought that the laws of motion and the arrangement of the celestial system expressed design regardless of its suitability for human existence.
Yes, and well, he was religious. He saw the universe as a great puzzle, just as he saw the book of Daniel as a great puzzle. And it was God leaving messages for human beings to puzzle out. And he puzzled out the way the solar system worked, and he tried to puzzle out the chronology of the Bible. Well, we don't do that anymore.
But might there be any reason, and in fact you still find people, and indeed some of your own colleagues, who feel that nevertheless the regularity, by definition, involves and invokes a regulator?
Well, it doesn't. There is a mystery, I have to admit. You know, we try to understand nature, and we ask questions, and we get answers, and then we ask more follow-up questions. Well, why is that true? And we ultimately hope to come to some set of elegant physical principles that describe everything. And when we have it, the mystery will still be there, because we'll always have to ask, why is it that theory and not some other theory? And one answer is, well, that is the regularity imposed on it by a spirit, a designer. But that doesn't answer anything. I mean, then you have to say, well, why is the designer like that? You know, either by a designer you have something in particular in mind, a God who is benevolent or jealous or humorous, whatever, or you have nothing in mind. If you have nothing in mind, let's not talk about it. And if you have something in mind, then the question arises, well, why is that true? So I don't see that having a designer puts us at rest. I think we're permanently in the tragic position of not being able to understand at the deepest possible level why things are the way they are. And we'll just have to live with that. But saying, well, it's a designer doesn't settle it, doesn't help.
But let's say, and I'm being, as it were, the deist's advocate here, or
instead of the devil's advocate.
Instead of the devil's advocate. Let's say that it doesn't exhibit, or it doesn't answer the question of design, but if there is this insuperable mystery, might one understand how it is that people feel that in the presence of such a mystery, that they, as it were, it's the thin end of some sort of theological wedge into which spirituality or an originator can be inserted?
Oh,
I mean, I don't feel that.
I don't feel that way either. I suppose many do. I think much more likely is that people are religious because they know they're going to die, and they know their loved ones are going to die. And that's the tragedy. It's not that bothers them. It's not the tragedy of not being able to come to the final cause. It's the tragedy of knowing that your life and all the wonderful things that you can do and living and the people you love, that's all going to end. It seems to me that provides the driving force for religion much more than these philosophical wonderings about first cause. These issues of the beginning of time were discussed very intelligently long ago by Augustine, and who grappled with the question of what there was before time began. And he said God created the world with time, that time was created, there was no before, that's part of the creation. That's as good an answer as any, I guess.
But it is interesting that someone like Augustine, without the benefits of quantum physics, without the benefits of Einstein, without the benefits of any of your sort of work, was able to invoke ideas such as time itself having a beginning.
Yes. Well, Augustine was a very clever man, and it's wonderful, looking back over all the thousands of years of speculation about these things, that time, I think first with Galileo, became part of the ordinary ambit of science. I mean, Galileo was the first person who tried to measure time during a physical process, measured the time it took for various balls to roll down an inclined plane. And he got the rule that the distance traveled is proportional to the square of the time. Nobody before had ever tried to bring time into the laws of nature quantitatively.
But for Galileo, observing these regularities and observing the relationship between these balls rolling down slopes, the time it took, and giving a mathematical expression for that, for him, as an unquestioningly religious man, they were, in fact, demonstrations of God's mind.
Well, I don't think Galileo came to that conclusion. If he did, I'm not aware of it. But if what you're suggesting is that there is no necessary conflict between being a scientist and being religious, I suppose I have to agree. Even now, there are very fine scientists who are deeply religious. I know a few. But I think what happened, and it only began to happen with Galileo and Newton, so it took a long time to mature. What happened was that much of the early basis for religious belief was dissolved by science. And it wasn't that scientific discoveries made religion impossible. It's that they made irreligion possible. It became possible to understand how things worked without the religious explanation. And particularly, I think more important than anything any physicist did was what Darwin did, Darwin and Wallace.
Yes, well, this is the argument which we've had, I think from Dennet, from Daniel Dennet. He feels that perhaps the most wounding influence upon religion really came with Darwin rather than with Galileo.
Oh, I agree. I agree. Even though it hurts my pride as a physicist to say so, because people don't really care that much about the way the planets go around the sun, or the way certainly they don't care about the balls rolling down the inclined plane. What they care about is life, and particularly their own life, and their relationship to the causes for them being the way they are. They care about that. And Darwin's revision of the understanding of why living things are the way they are, in particular why people are the way they are, was overwhelming. And Darwin himself lost his faith. I was recently rereading Lytton Strachey's wonderful little biography of Cardinal Manning in Eminent Victorians, and Manning said that he became convinced, a convinced Christian, because of reading Paley's
Natural Theology. Yeah.
Yes, and the wonderful adaptation of living things convinced him that there had to be a creator, a personality that created all this. And suddenly that was gone. There wasn't a discovery that there wasn't a creator, but the argument was removed. And I don't think anything that science has done for general culture has ever been as important as that.
Yes, it is interesting to find that, on the whole, the percentage of biological disbelievers in the scientific community is higher than the percentage of disbelievers amongst your colleagues in physics and chemistry.
Is that true? I didn't know that. Actually, I've occasionally, not too often, gotten into conversations with my physicist colleagues about religion. I find an overwhelming lack of interest in it. I once said that they don't care enough about it to qualify as practicing atheists. They just regard it as a sort of question that it's silly to raise. And I, for some obscure reason, I tend to care about it, and I'm interested in religion, but most of my physicist friends are not. But you find such a variety of beliefs. I have one friend, a very distinguished astrophysicist, who told me that he's an Orthodox, observant Jew, which is a lot of trouble. You know, that's not easy, and doesn't believe in God. Because for him, the religion is a framework for life that he inherited from his parents. He grew up with it. He wants to stay in it, but he doesn't think there's anything behind it. I think probably a fair number of people in the Church of England feel that way.
I think for a number of people, the retreat into religion is, as you say, not a retreat into belief, but a retreat into reassuring domestic ritual. And I suspect that's much greater for Jews than it is for Christians. I mean, there is a way in which one could say that belief is less important for Jews than observance.
I think that's very true. One could argue about the reasons for it, but I don't think Judaism is the only religion for which that's true. I think it's also true for Hinduism. I don't think the Hindus have ever looked very closely into what they all believe. They're allowed to believe in all sorts of things, but the important thing is, you know, the Brahmins are not supposed to cross the ocean, and you're not supposed to kill cows. That's what's important. What you really think about Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva, I don't think there was ever an inquisition among the Hindus. On the other hand, then you have religions like Christianity, Islam, and I guess to some extent Buddhism. These are the religions that have missionaries that go out and try to convert other people. And it's in these religions that have universalist ambitions that theology becomes important. And it does become important. And in a way, I'm more attracted to that because as a scientist, I care about searching for truth and making a theory of the world. And Christianity, or Buddhism for that matter, provides an alternative theory of the world. And that's something I feel I have something to say about. I can interact with, I can respond to. On the other hand, if people just want to not eat pork or not kill cows or whatever it is, well, you know, more power to them. It has nothing to do with me, and there's no argument there.
So you feel a realistic and vigorous sense of opposition.
Yeah.
In that that Christianity and Buddhism, in a rather different way, are in fact, as it were, more intellectually intelligible and complementary to a scientific worldview.
Yes. They have a theory, and it's a theory that I don't agree with, but there is a theory there. And without a theory, what can I say? Then it's not something that I can engage. I once wrote something rather disparaging about ultra-liberal Christianity, and that I found myself more in some ways more akin to a fundamentalist, because at least they haven't forgotten what it is to believe something. And I got a copy of a fundamentalist newspaper I think from New Mexico, that praised me because I think what their real concern was not the odd atheist physicist. That wasn't what they're worried about. What they're worried about are the liberal Christians.
Oh, I see. So that in fact, that the fundamentalist Christians see you scientists as worthy opponents.
Well,
in the same way that you scientists or you physicists are seeing.
I wouldn't draw that implication. I think they just found a surprising ally in the battle that they really care about, their battle with the liberal wing of Christianity. But please don't let me give the wrong impression. I think enormous harm is done by religion, not just in the name of religion, but actually by religion. And I think
how is it? Tell me the harm that is done by religion as opposed to the harm that's done in the name of it.
Well, I think people who crash airplanes into office buildings in order to destroy them must really believe in paradise, and that this is something that their God wants them to do, and that they'll be rewarded in paradise. And if they don't believe that, then it's a very foolish career move.
Yes.
But the idea that God has, whether it's Allah or Jehovah or whatever, has dictated certain ways of behaving, certain ways of worshiping, and that it's incumbent on you to force others to behave that way and worship in that way. God, think of all the harm that's been done throughout all the ages by people who believe that, and believed it very sincerely. One could just go on and on and on about the number of very sincerely religious people who were led by their religion to do the most awful things.
But in fact, that was very much an aspect of Judaism before the diaspora.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I do agree. But just coming back to what we were talking about before, it is the religions that have a theory of the world, it seems to me, at least in recent centuries, that do the harm. So the very sincere, true believers are the ones you have to watch out for, even though they may have something more to show for themselves intellectually than the more liberal religious, but they're the dangerous ones.
Well, given the fact that the current president of the United States could be described as a sincere, true believer, I wanted to know whether Stephen himself was alarmed by the apparent growth of fundamentalist Christianity in his own country.
I don't see the United States in the grips of a really disturbing religious awakening. I think what's much more frightening in the world is Islam, where people, it seems to me, take their religion seriously to the point of madness. I think, there have been times in the history of the world when Islam was a far more tolerant religion than Christianity, but that is not the case now.
But there is undoubtedly, certainly for a European, the impression that there's a very strong association between Christianity and patriotism in a way that simply doesn't exist in Europe, certainly not in my own country, in the United Kingdom.
Yes, I know that impression exists, and I think Americans think more highly of religion than Europeans do. I sometimes think that Americans believe in religion much more than Europeans do. They don't believe in God much more than Europeans do, but they believe that religion is good for you.
Oh, yes.
And without being particularly religious in any meaningful way. I know many people who say they're religious and go to church every Sunday and belong to church organizations, and then when you talk to them and you ask them, well, do you really think after death this is going to happen? They say, I have no idea, I don't know. It's all a mystery, but I think it's good to be religious. This is the faith I grew up with. As a physicist, you have to decide what you think is true, and you get in the habit of that kind of intellectual activity. And because if you work on the wrong theory and it isn't true, you wasted your professional time, and you keep having to make judgments of truth or falsity. And so truth becomes very important to you. For most people, truth is not as important as good behavior or loyalty to your ethnic group or loyalty to your family traditions. And truth is something that you don't worry about very much.
Although, of course, that in the Middle Ages, and indeed when people were opposing atheism in the 17th century, it was insisted that the truthfulness of religion was what guaranteed good behavior.
Yes, and many people believe that. But an awful lot of people also believe it doesn't matter whether it's true. You have to be religious because that will guarantee good behavior. The wonderful line of Gibbon's about the pagan religions, he said, in the multitude of gods, Gibbon said, the common people found them all equally true, and the philosophers found them all equally false, and the magistrates found them all equally useful.
Oh, yes.
And I think many people in America and undoubtedly in Europe are in the position of the magistrates that Gibbon was talking about. They find them useful. Although I really don't think that, I don't see religion as actually inspiring moral behavior. In fact, you very often hear people say, well, these people who blow themselves up for some religious reason in the Middle East, or Hindu mobs who destroy a mosque, or Muslim mobs who kill Hindus, or that they're not really religious, that real religion doesn't involve that kind of behavior. I think what they're saying is that they have a moral sense which allows them to distinguish what is religious from what is not religious. I think, for example, George Bush said that these terrorists have hijacked a great religion. So, because their actions, their terrorist actions, don't fit his idea of religion. You see, what's really happening there is that instead of using religion to decide what is moral, they're using their moral sense, which fortunately is a perfectly good, reasonable, enlightened moral sense, to decide what is religious. And if that's the case, then what's the point of the religion?
Finally, I wanted to know whether there were any particular reasons, apart from being constantly asked by people like myself, why Stephen felt it necessary to address himself to the topic of religion more than many of his colleagues did.
Oh, I try not to do it too much. I don't want to become the village atheist, and I do get involved in a lot of other issues like missile defense and post-constructionism, neo-modernism. But I do spend probably a little bit more time than I should on religion, and I have a certain amount of hostility to it. I think the most rational reason for it is because of the harm that I see it does. We were talking about that earlier. Many people do simply awful things out of sincere religious belief, not using religion as a cover, the way Saddam Hussein may have done, but really because they believe that this is what God wants them to do, going all the way back to Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac because God told him to do that. Putting God ahead of humanity is a terrible thing. Another reason is because I'm offended by the kind of smarmy religiosity that's all around us, perhaps more in America than in Europe, and not really that harmful, because not really that intense or even that serious. But just, after a while, you get tired of hearing clergymen giving the invocation at various public celebrations, and you feel, haven't we outgrown all this? Do we have to listen to this? But then, maybe at the very bottom of it, I really don't like God. It's silly to say I don't like God because I don't believe in God, but in the same sense that I don't like Iago, or I don't like the Reverend Slope, or any of the other villains of literature. The God of traditional Judaism and Christianity and Islam seems to me a terrible character. He's a God who's obsessed with the degree to which people worship him and anxious to punish with the most awful torments those who don't worship him in the right way. Now, I realize that many people don't believe in that anymore who call themselves Muslims or Jews or Christians, but that is the traditional God, and he's a terrible character. I don't like him. I have a friend, or had a friend, now dead, Abdus Salam, a very devout Muslim, who was trying to bring science into the universities in the Gulf states. And he told me that he had a terrible time because although they were very receptive to technology, they felt that science would be a corrosive to religious belief, and they were worried about it. And damn it, I think they were right. It is corrosive of religious belief. And it's a good thing, too.
That's terrific. I've always enjoyed my private conversations with the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, and I knew the importance he attached to Darwin's theory of evolution in the development of disbelief. So I asked him why he'd called his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And one of the points he made was simply that the theory of evolution was easy to understand, and that's what made it so dangerously subversive.
Unlike some other great scientific advances, going back to Newton or certainly Einstein or best case perhaps quantum theory, unlike these bizarre revolutions, I think that Darwin's theory is really quite easy to understand. You don't need any math. The basic idea is so simple that you have variation, that inevitably, if there's variation in the population, some are going to be better than others, and the ones that are better than others are going to have more kids than the ones, than the less favored ones, and the offspring are going to resemble their parents. That gives you this little ratchet. And indeed, the idea that you could do that much lifting with a simple ratchet is a stunner. And most of the skepticism has been along the lines of, well, there's just too much work to be done by such a simple process. But time and again, it's been shown, no, there's enough time. The process is more powerful than you might think.
But you can understand why it was that at the beginning, these minute ratchets, minute teeth on the ratchet, would have been seen as implausible contributions to something which was an adaptation. What I'm interested in is, why do you think it was that Darwin's idea was seen as so dangerous rather than simply nonsensical? For the first 50 years, there wasn't enough information to make Darwin's idea anything other than implausible and irreverent. Why was it seen as so dangerous at that time?
Well, in spite of Darwin's best efforts, the implications were there for anybody to draw, and that is, he's not just talking about birds and bees and flowers. He's talking about us. He's talking about our minds. He's talking about our conscience, our soul. Everything, if Darwin is right, is made up of little ratchets doing their little ratchety thing. And it's all just mechanical and blind and purposeless at the bottom. And this was the great inversion, because until then, the idea that that there was something like a life force, élan vital, or that there was something like a soul that was completely distinct from matter, and that it somehow informed and controlled and guided creative processes, thinking processes, moral reasoning, and so forth. This top-down idea about morality and self and soul was very plausible until Darwin. And after Darwin, people could see that maybe the soul could be replaced with some of those ratchets. And that's a very threatening idea.
So if Darwin had not produced this dangerous idea, do you think that the development of infidelity, atheism, or disbelief, or however one wants to call it, would have been delayed?
I suppose that's a historical question that one should do very careful research on, and I haven't. But it seems very plausible to me that it was Darwin that broke the dam. Because before Darwin, there really wasn't a good answer to the question, how did this come to be? How did this bird with this wonderful wing, how did it come into existence? If not by some divine act of creation. The rhetorical question, what else could it be, had no answer. That was what William Paley had said, and I think it's important to realize that Paley's argument from design is actually very, very powerful. It challenges any thinker to come up with an alternative. And Darwin called his bluff. He didn't deny the Paley argument. He said, I'm going to meet it head on. Yes, there's fantastic design in the biosphere, and I'm going to show you how you can get that design without a designer.
However, even if Darwin had succeeded in demonstrating how you can get the illusion of design without having to postulate the existence of a designer, it's still hard to resolve the problem of the relationship between minds and brains, so that philosophers, like Descartes, for example, had long ago insisted that the brain and mind were entirely separate, and even now there's a persistent belief that the mind, the soul, or whatever you want to call it, has an immaterial existence. Well, Daniel Dennett has written eloquently about the problem of consciousness, so I asked him about Darwin's attitude to this problem. Why was it that Descartes was able to preserve the immaterial soul, and Darwin somehow felt, albeit a Christian, that he did not feel it possible to preserve a comparable sanctuary?
That's a good question, and especially because Wallace was able to make precisely the Cartesian move. Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection, said that it covered everything up to the human soul. And he drew the line there, exactly where Descartes drew the line. Wallace said, no, we have to make an exception for the human mind. And Darwin famously wrote him a letter saying, I think you will kill our child. To Darwin, it was clear that the Cartesian stop, the Maginot line, was indefensible, simply because it was clear that we're primates, we're mammals. The continuity of nature was not going to permit one species on the planet to have miracle stuff in its brain when no other species did. I was once interviewed in Italy, and the headline of the interview the next day was wonderful. I saved this for my collection. It was, Sì, abbiamo un'anima, ma è fatta di tanti piccoli robot. Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. And I thought, exactly right. Yes, we have a soul, but it's mechanical. But it's still a soul. It still does the work that the soul was supposed to do. It is the seat of reason. It is the seat of moral responsibility. It's why we are appropriate objects of punishment when we do evil things, why we deserve the praise when we do good things. it's just not a mysterious lump of wonder stuff.
Which will outlive us.
Which will outlive us, yes. We do have to give that up. And I'm sure that that's a big part of the inexhaustible appeal of the idea of a soul. All you have to confront is the task of consoling a child whose parent has died, and the natural appeal of the idea of a soul that goes on living it's just undeniable. It takes a strong person indeed to not to avail himself of that crutch when responding to a child who's just facing the loss of a loved one.
Or indeed an adult facing the loss of a loved adult as well.
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
The loss of anyone. So that,
sure.
Really we're saying that the notion of an immaterial soul, by definition, because it's immaterial, is that it's also indestructible.
I think the source of the idea of the immaterial soul that lives on after death is probably largely connected with the fact that the purpose of our living souls, the purpose of our brains, is to project into the future. It's to foresee the future and to have plans and hopes about the future. And those projects and plans and anticipations make us who we are. And we share them. And so we know that the anticipated trajectories of people, and we have our own anticipations for their trajectories. We have hopes for our children and fears for our friends when they go off and do dangerous things. And it's this forward-looking, future-producing activity of the nervous system which we can't just turn off. And when somebody dies, all of those projects are suddenly put into abeyance. It's hard to turn them off. And so the most natural thing in the world to go on thinking about them. And thinking about, well, if Sam were still here, he'd be saying this and we'd be doing this. And it's a short step from there to say, well, he is still here. Well, not here, but here.
But I find it very hard to see how they can actually formulate or conceive the notion of an immaterial continuity of an unembodied self, of how it would know that it was, in fact, the thing that had once been the embodied person with a particular name, with particular projects. It always seems to me that the project, the notion of projects and trajectories and hopes and plans and so forth are all tied up with being embodied.
Oh, yes, and I think that everybody cheats when they think about this. I mean, in the way that scientists cheat too when they imagine hard to imagine things. So people, when they imagine an immaterial soul, they don't. They imagine a sort of ghosty, sort of semi-transparent material object that's got arms and legs and a particular physical location, but just isn't quite physical. It's sort of like a hologram, and they know that that's not right. They know that a soul isn't really like that, and they know they can't really imagine an immaterial, disembodied soul. But that's all right. These things are hard to imagine, and physicists can't imagine quantum mechanics, and we can't imagine an immaterial soul. But we can try, and it doesn't hurt to think about people playing harps sitting on clouds. No, I often ask my students when they were children and reading comic books or they were watching on television, did it ever bother them that Casper the Friendly Ghost could both fly through a wall and catch a ball? I said, why doesn't the ball just go right through his hand? And almost all of them say, oh yes, they hadn't noticed this mildly discomforting inconsistency, but everybody goes along with the gag. But everybody notices that this is not really consistent.
All right, then. Given the fact that both you and I subscribe to a radical, unreformed Darwinism, how do we live with the notion of the mechanization of our own picture, the radical mechanization of our own picture? What does it leave us with as persons if, in fact, we turn out to be these products of ratcheting?
Well, I think it leaves us almost exactly where we've always been. We get a clearer view of the actual machinery of our souls, if you like. But what we thought our souls were for, what they were good for loving and for deciding, for making and breaking promises for reasons good and bad, that goes on. And we're just a little bit less disillusioned, I should say, about the nature of that process. But our moral quandaries are what they were before. Our moral aspirations are what they were before. Our capacity to love or to hate are intact. When I speak about Darwinism as universal acid, it passes through, it changes everything, and it leaves everything the same, too.
Finally, and this issue cropped up in many of my conversations, I wanted to know how difficult Daniel found it to publicize his disbelief in modern America. But I started by asking him whether there had ever been a time when he himself had had religious beliefs. Now, here you are, from everything you've said and from everything you've written, I suspect that you and I would in fact be called by other people atheists. Was there a point at which you became one? Had you always been one? Or is there in fact a history of the development of disbelief on your part?
I was raised in one of those bland New England suburban Protestant faiths, the congregational faith, which has hardly any creed at all, but lots of good hymns and ceremonies. And I went to Sunday school and learned the books of the Bible in order: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, etc. So I got a good deal of biblical lore, but not a stern religious upbringing by any stretch of the imagination. And I was always interested in it. Intellectually, philosophically, I was a little budding philosopher. I suppose I was a teenager before I began to realize that my interest in this was I feel like academic. I didn't believe it at all. And I didn't seriously think about whether I'd ever believed it, or whether it had been just part of a tradition that it was, go along with it because it's a bit offensive to challenge something like this. I mean, if you see a terribly obese person, you don't walk up and say, "My God, you're obese." We don't do things like that. It's just impolite. And if people around you are being devout, it's worse than rude to challenge them. And so I don't think I ever really I never had a conversion experience. I just gradually realized that I didn't believe any of this. I don't think I encountered many people in my youth who really believed in God. I think most people who say they believe in God, most people in the West who say they believe in God actually believe in belief in God. I don't even believe in belief in God. That is, they believe that belief in God is a really good thing. It is something to strive for, something to be maybe proud of if you succeed. Certainly you should try to believe in God, and you certainly shouldn't make it hard for others to believe in God. And the behavior of somebody who believes in belief in God is just the behavior we observe. you go to church, you sing hymns, you give money to the church, and so forth. If you actually believed in God, you do all sorts of lunatic things, and we don't see very many people doing those things. They don't put their lives on the line for God, typically. And I thought it was a little bit like belief in Santa Claus. It's something that we do. We talk about it. We sort of pretend to believe in God, and maybe the immature ones actually believe in God. And then some people grow out of it.
Why is it that we have such compunctions about people's faith and devoutness, whereas we're perfectly willing to be rude and argumentative and difficult with people's political beliefs? What is it about the belief in the sacred which is sacred?
I don't know, and I've been wondering that a good deal, because there are times when I think it would be much better if we were a lot franker and ruder about religious belief. If we look around the world today, I would say that by far more danger, more harm comes from religious belief on every side than help. Yes, religions, at their best, provide succor and meaning and comfort to people who are really hard-pressed. And I think that's what we don't want to deny to people.
Yes, I mean, I don't. But nevertheless, I'm often rebuked for being bloody rude about people's religious beliefs. I have very few compunctions about getting into arguments, often in public places, about religion. And I will then go away, and my wife says, you really mustn't talk like that to things that people hold sacred. Yeah. And yet, she would be much less embarrassed if I was to have a stand-up row about Soviet communism and about the atrocities committed by Stalin.
I, myself, do not think that truth is sufficient justification for saying something. And I think we all know that. We don't tell fat people they're fat. We don't tell ugly people they're ugly. We don't, there's lots of things every day we can go around saying things to people's faces that would be perfectly true, and we could prove them, and it would just be really mischievous. It would just, there's things about me that I'm glad I don't know, and I hope other people don't know. I certainly wouldn't want people going around spreading this around and things about you. There's lots of facts that we're just as well off not knowing. That being so, any area of inquiry, especially something like philosophy, which gets so close to things that matter so much to people, I think we have to think seriously about what the, if you like, the environmental impact of putting a view out there is. It's possible that some real mischief, some real harm might come from presenting a position which is in itself perfectly true. But let's look at the boundaries of this. If somebody's a member of a cult, as we say, we have no trouble being rude with them, with laughing at the Raelians or those people that got interested in the comet, various doomsday prophesiers when the prophecies don't come true. We laugh at those people, and the world laughs with us at them. So we have a line where we consider some religious belief to be just too kooky to take seriously, and we are rude with impunity in talking about those.
But is it because they're minority opinions?
I think so. I think that's all it is. But I think this is just political. If Christianity were a small sect in the world, I think it wouldn't receive the respect. But look at all those churches that the Christians have built. Look at all the great arts. Look at all the great music. It's hard to be rude to a religion which has created so much great culture. I've had this friendly disagreement with Richard Dawkins over just this issue. And I say, Richard, I, of course, completely agree with you, but I don't think you want to hurt people's feelings. Why do you want to hurt people's? Why do you want? And for a long time, I thought he didn't have a good reply to that. And more recently, I've been thinking, man, maybe I should hurt a few more people's feelings. Maybe we should turn the tide a bit on this. Maybe we should get out in front of this. Yeah. And yes, we'll take some awful lumps because we'll be the rude, evil ones. But let's see if we can just move the barrier a little bit. But maybe we should get out there with Richard and be more aggressive, just to open up the space behind us. I mean, I think this is true not just in this area. I think in religion, I think that what America really needs right now is some outspoken, bold, serious liberals. Yes, they can't be elected, but let them get out there and make a big noise so that to move the center, to move the effective center.
And particularly in the United States, where in fact it is very closely tied up with Christian belief.
Certainly is.
I mean, it's true that our own Prime Minister is a very pious Christian. But I don't think one can detect, as one can in Bush and one can in the right wing of the Republican Party here, a constitutive relationship between right wing politics and born again Christianity.
Oh yes, they have the strange overconfidence of the religious zealot. They're sure that the world is what their religion says it is. There's the good guys and the bad guys, and we're the good guys. And we will smite the bad guys.
Now, granted your increasing sense of the importance of being explicit and outright and forthright about this, here you are, you've written some important, influential books on various aspects of philosophy and various aspects of science in which philosophy has interests. It's hard to imagine an area in which philosophy would have more interests than religion. What would you feel about writing a book which did, in fact, smite religion with the same energy that religion itself would like to smite people like us?
Oh, I'd love to write that book, if I could. But, of course, what one fears is what comes afterwards. And just how much disarray, how right are the people who think that we need religion to preserve whatever veneer of civilization and good feeling we have? I think religion, for many people, is sort of, moral Viagra. They think some people need help being moral, and don't deny it to them. Well, if that's true, if religion does help people lead moral lives, then one should take very seriously the proposition that we're just going to eliminate it and let the devil take the hindmost. Because the hindmost may be a great many people, and we might have the chaos that these people fear. And a lot of people, many people, they want their life to have a meaning. And where is it going to come from?
Yes, but there must be something better than religion. But
yes, we certainly hope there is. What's it going to be?
That's it.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, sorry.
Now, in his long professional life as one of America's most distinguished playwrights, Arthur Miller has brought warmth, wit, and intelligence to bear on the American scene. When I met him in his New York apartment, I asked him about his early life, about his attitude to Judaism, and the extent to which he felt that there has grown up in our time a strange association in the Christian mind between Judaism and disbelief. The idea that there's something peculiar about the Jews which makes them peculiarly susceptible to profane disbelief.
Well, of course, the anti-Semitism goes under 1,000 disguises, and one of them is certainly that the Jews are atheists at heart.
Of course, they don't believe in Christ. And that makes anybody, if not an atheist, then pretty close. A heathen, perhaps.
When you were a boy in Brooklyn, were you in an Orthodox or observing family?
They were observing 2 or 3 times a year. Apart from that, they were busy trying to make a living, and the rest of it. We were not. They were. If they were anything, they were observant or Orthodox. But that only occurred during the high holidays. The rest of the time, they were free to do whatever they wanted. They didn't go to synagogue every Saturday. They didn't pray. It was a kind of obedient nod in the right direction.
But as a child of that type of family, which I suppose in some way was similar to mine, though it was perhaps less observant than the one you describe, did you yourself begin to differ from the Orthodox background from which you came?
Well, I tried to be a religious person when I was 12, 13, 14. It lasted about 2 years. And then it simply vanished. I simply laid down one evening to go to sleep and woke up the next day and it wasn't there anymore. And I guess it was part of my growing up that I would be searching for my roots somewhere, and I found them elsewhere. I didn't find them in religion, because religion, especially in the Depression 30s, seemed absolutely absurdly irrelevant. We were in the midst of a terrific social crisis here, and the religious, in general, had nothing to say about it.
But were there other reasons apart from the political irrelevance of religion? Did you have, as it were, other reasons, say, sort of rational reasons for thinking?
Of course, I no longer could believe. I quickly, at some point in my late teens, began reading and surmising that the idea of religion was a creation of man's longing to signify, to be a permanent part of the universe. And as I've grown older, I have to respect some of the religious people, because some of them, as you know, during the struggles we've had, have been terrific. And they've been motivated by religious principle in many cases. And therefore, I don't dismiss the whole thing by any means. For myself personally, I don't have the talent to believe. That's the way I look at it. I simply haven't got. I keep seeing my grandfather instead of God. And it doesn't work anymore. But philosophically, if I can use that word, it just seems to me so patent that what man has done is to project himself into the heavens, where he can be all-powerful, as he's not here, and moral, and decent, and vengeful, and all the things he's not allowed to do on the earth, and to don that white garment and the beard, and be what he wished in his dreams he could be. And I can't get past that.
These childhood memories prompted another thought about the extent to which religious skepticism amongst certain Jews was associated with left-wing sympathies. So I asked Arthur Miller if he thought that this supposed association had any part to play in the development of 20th century anti-Semitism. There is an undoubtedly close relationship between Jews and the left, and also a sort of a trio of beliefs: disbelief, in God, Judaism, and an affiliation with the very political movements which might have to be the ones which are recruited in order to bring about a solution to the problems that you've described.
Right.
Now, so why do you think, though, what is this relationship?
For one thing, the Jews felt that was a different period than now in one respect. The anti-Semitism in the United States was rampant. It was open. For example, many people had to go to Europe to become doctors. Mm-hmm. They weren't admitted to Columbia University, to almost all American universities had a quota on Jews, and it was very small. There was the largest radio audience in the United States was for a man who was quoting Goebbels all the time.
This was Father Coughlin. Mm.
He had the largest audience, excepting for FDR. He was saying how wonderfully the Nazis had dealt with unemployment, how fine it was that they were defending their racial purity. This from a Catholic priest. I remember walking down the street in Brooklyn one day, a hot day in the middle of July, and all the windows were open. And I think it was on a Sunday afternoon, and from one house after another, you could hear that voice. And it was a sneering, raucous. He was a real rabble-rouser. He blamed the Jews for the Depression. Mm-hmm. That was the fundamental thing, that the money lenders had been thrown out of the temple, but they were back in. And they controlled the currency, they controlled the big corporations, they controlled everything, secretly. They were the secret demon underlying the troubles of the state. I was a worker in those days. I was out driving trucks and the rest of it, and you could cut it with a knife. It was brutal, and it was open. There was no question about it. So Jews were already positioned vis-a-vis the society as being, they weren't being killed, they were simply being gently and firmly kept out of the mainstream. No big corporation had Jewish executives. It was unheard of. So one understood what persecution might be, and therefore you were driven to the left, because the right was not interested in these problems, nor were most liberals. It was too dangerous. After all, a shipload of Jews from Germany arrived in New York Harbor and was not permitted to land. And these were not impoverished, desperate people. You know, these were middle-class people to have had the money to make this trip and to pick up all their stuff and move out of Germany. And they were sent back. It was called, the name of the ship was the St. Louis. And then they went from here to Cuba, where, from the studies I've read, the Americans did not want the Cuban government, which was then a dictatorship of the right, to let them in, lest it show up what we had done and reveal the cruelty of what we had done. Nobody was interested in confronting this thing, and they were sent back to Germany. I presume they were all killed.
Well, I remember talking to a Polish intellectual and him saying, we can accept the idea that Jesus was Jew, but what sticks in our throat is the idea that the Holy Mother was Jewish.
Oh, God. It's exhausting just to think about where to begin to throw light on this whole thing. I wrote a play called The Creation of the World and Other Business, which is about Genesis. And I didn't mean to, but I got involved with the Bible in a way that I'd never had before. And it's very interesting that the old rabbis, whoever put the Bible together, which was obviously written by different people at different times in history, they could have chosen any book to start the Bible. It was no doubt, or the whole thing was lying on a table in front of them. Some editor had to say, this is the opener. And they opened with a fratricide. And the fratricide was there, I suppose, because that's the worst thing that can happen, is that two brothers, one of them is killed by the other brother because it doesn't involve the outsider.
And yet it does. You see, I remember reading, I don't know whether you ever saw this book by Ruth Mellenkopf called I think it's called The Outsider, and it's a collection of images in art history of the representation of these various figures in the Bible. And in the early years of the 16th century, Cain is Jewish, Abel is Gentile.
How did that happen?
Just the way they in order to get round the problem of the fratricide, they had to somehow retrospectively identify the villainous Jew. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. In some of these early German pictures, you see this blonde Abel and this ringleted and bearded Cain.
I'll tell you a quick story. In the early 50s, I was traveling with a friend of mine in Foggia, because at the moment he was looking for an aunt he'd never met who was a school teacher in the city of Foggia, and we found her. And he's Italian-American and Catholic, and she was curious to know what I was, and he said, he's Hebreo, he's Jewish, and she looked surprised, and he said, you know the people in the Bible? She said, oh, yes. She says, well, as long as they believe in Christ. Of course, I suppose it's inevitable that, and will always be there to some degree, that one's own group being most familiar is less dangerous than an out group, which is always menacing because it's strange. They look different. They don't speak the way we do. They break the boiled egg on the narrow end instead of the broad end. This is going to go on forever, but when politicians seize upon these differences or these apprehensions,
particularly the religious differences,
and when they make religious differences the center of the political program, that's when the end is nigh.
Well, the end certainly felt a bit nigh when we met, as the war in Iraq was already well underway. So I asked Arthur why it was that skepticism is increasingly seen by many Americans as politically incorrect, as subversive, unacceptable, and, of course, unpatriotic. I get the impression that from the vantage point of Europe, for the last 18 months at least, and perhaps before, that atheism or disbelief or skepticism is seen by many Americans as politically incorrect, as subversive and unacceptable. Am I right in thinking that?
It's probably the case. They certainly the religious overlay of patriotism has come into fashion. It's always there, of course, in this country. More people go to church here than I think anywhere. But it's gotten heavier now. They invoke God at any opportunity, whether it's buying an automobile or.
Do you think is that since 9/11, or do you think
it was always here, but it's gotten thicker, it's gotten heavier, because it's such an easy way to cuddle up to what they think the majority is about, which is this slavish kind of worship of something, and it's a political event.
But it is the first time for many years that you've had a government, a president.
Well, I don't recall it ever being the government itself doing this. It could have happened, but I'm not aware of it. I mean, I never heard of a government calling upon faith-based agencies taking care of the sick and the unemployed and the rest of it. Formerly, the government simply did these things as much as they ever did.
And one also gets the impression that the enterprise in Iraq had a sort of faith-based patriotism. It wasn't just patriotic,
right.
It was Christian patriotic.
Of course, in wartime, I suppose we did that in the Second World War to a degree, but it was never laid on with a trowel this way. I think Roosevelt called upon God occasionally, but it didn't bother him too much.
Did you ever get the impression that although he called upon God, which he might have done, as it were, nominally, but did you ever get the impression that he was, in fact, a Christian beyond the call of duty?
He was not using it. This is now being used as a means of persuasion. It's patent, it's obvious. They call upon God to initiate a program, whatever it may be, a civil program of some sort. And they lard it over with some religious verbiage to make it seem as though if you oppose this, you oppose the Lord. There are a lot of Americans, I think they're a minority, but they're very vocal, are really aching for an Ayatollah. I think they would love to have a department of religion. We go back to the early 17th century, perhaps, and have a church, an official church. But they've convinced a lot of people to forget that this country was founded by people who were really escaping the domination of a governmental religion and who breathed freely here with gratitude that they didn't have to obey a church government, churchly government.
But they then became as theocratic as the people that they left.
It seems to be something that has to be resisted on principle from one generation to another. At the moment, it's tougher than ever because the government itself is blatantly on the side of an official religion, I think. What is bothering me about the whole thing is that we're now more and more confronting a real issue in this country about the attempt of the religious, so-called religious, because I'm not sure they are religious. I think they're very nationalist people. Mm-hmm. And the wedding of Christianity or Judaism with nationalism is lethal, in my opinion. If you look at every violent conflict in the world now is being led by priests, rabbis, or Muslim clerics. It's quite amazing. I wonder whether it ever happened or whether it's happened in hundreds and hundreds of years. It's the church militant in all these religions. They've moved in, they've added that lethal mixture of religion and nationalism to the programs that they sell, and the reason it's lethal is because to believe in a religion means that you don't believe in a different religion. You can't believe in two religions. You've got to believe in one, and the other ones are wrong.
And often to be destroyed.
And deserve to be combated and destroyed. I mean, it's implicit in the whole idea of religious belief, I think, in the normal way that religious belief is thought of. You can't be both a Catholic and a Protestant.
Well, and now there seems to be this, what would previously have been almost inconceivable, this unholy alliance between fundamentalist evangelical Christians in the United States and Orthodox Jews,
yes,
who are combining to support the
Christian zealots believe that Christ will return when the Jews become Christians. This news is going to come with a shock to most of the Jews that hear it, but that's the program. That Armageddon comes, at which point the Jews become believers in Christ, and Christ returns, and we're off to the races. It's pretty heady stuff.
And it's become particularly virulent in the last almost 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, it's a form of intellectual bankruptcy, which is, I think, it's taken over a lot of the political space.
Well, although he's considerably older than I am, I think it's fair to say that neither Arthur Miller nor myself could be described as spring chickens, so it seemed reasonable to ask him what he felt about the prospect of a life after death.
Everything I say, which is very skeptical, if not worse,
is conditioned by one thing, and that is we don't know where life started or how. Nobody really knows that. And death is the end of consciousness is the awesome mystery that anybody who's lived at all knows he has no answer to. The idea that that consciousness could vanish, be no more, is unacceptable. It simply cannot. I have no way of accepting this.
Well, now, in your refusal to accept it, are you tempted to assume that in some mysterious way that it continues after some sort of, as it were, vacation?
That's right.
That it will resume somewhere?
That's what I find myself hoping.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And then I think, well, it does continue in art. And that the artist finally leaves us with his consciousness.
So that your work will outlast you. But do you feel, in any way, do you feel tempted to believe or hope that in addition to the work in which your memory will be preserved, that you yourself, in some alternative version, unembodied, will continue to exist and be conscious?
I no longer can contain that idea, no. But for others, for instance, my wife of 40 years died about a year and a half ago. And I'm surrounded by all her stuff of her life. And the idea that she's not here is still defeats some impulse to recreate her. But I know what that impulse is. It's simply the inability to accept this absurdity, that all that consciousness and all that beauty simply isn't there anymore.
And you don't, as obviously as believers do, Christians perhaps more than Jews, that there will be some sort of rendezvous.
No, this is beyond me. I don't have that at all. I don't believe it. I think, as I said, if there is memory, because what we're talking about is a form of remembrance. If there is that, it's in the deeds that one did, or the art that one created, or some cases perhaps in the children, but no more.
So you can't, as I can't, make sense of the idea of a continuing consciousness which outlasts the death of the body, in which that consciousness would, as it were, identify itself as being...
Wouldn't it be lovely?
Well, do you think it would be lovely?
Well, of course, there'd be so many of us. It'd be a rather crowded area. I think it'd be like the subway at 5 o'clock in the evening. You'd wish you could get off, I think.
But in addition to, as it were, the population problem,
The urge is always there, I think. The urge to preserve this thing. And if you're not careful, I suppose you could venture into everlasting life. But as I said earlier, death is the ultimate perplexity. And particularly, not the body so much as the consciousness. The ability to observe, to talk, to store up images, which is, we spend 60, 70, whatever many years accomplishing. And in a breeze, it blows away. I think we're stuck with the earth and with the lives we've got. And the immortality notion is simply past my capacity to really believe in. I never could figure out what we Jews believe about an afterlife. I have the feeling that it doesn't quite exist. It's a skeptical area.
Well, I'm always told by people who know or seem to know that it's not altogether different from a seminar at Columbia, that you in fact go to Moses, you enroll, and Moses teaches you to infinity the finer points of the law. Which seems
no
like,
way out of it.
But it does. That seems like locking the stable door after the horse is bolted. Now, the English biologist Richard Dawkins is probably almost as well known as an atheist as he is as a scientist. And it's clear in the conversation we had that the theory of evolution played a very important part in undermining his own religious belief. But as it happens, we met right at the start of the war in Iraq. So before we could get to Darwin, we started by contemplating the role that religion had played in the policies of a Christian British Prime Minister and a Christian American President.
Blair is obviously an order of magnitude more sophisticated intellectually than Bush. That wouldn't be difficult. But I suspect that whereas Bush is just plain naive, they probably both have some sort of an idea that there's a war going on between good and evil. And that, in Bush's case, and in the case of, I think, many Americans, I suspect that many of them can't tell the difference between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. I mean, that they're all evil. And so that's why it was so easy to switch the American public from a genuine fight against terrorism after September the 11th to a totally irrelevant fight against Iraq, which after all could have happened at any time. But what happened was that September the 11th focused everybody's attention on evil and the fact that there's a them against us. And it then became very easy to muddle up in people's minds anybody evil.
Now, in identifying them as exponents of evil, I believe, and I'm sure you do, that they actually think that evil is a principle of some sort which exists in the universe, a spirit. Now, do you think that that notion of evil as an autonomous principle is inseparably associated with a religious belief in a deity?
Well, I think it's very similar, and I think that there is a sort of impulse in humans to personify and to, instead of just recognizing that evil and good are descriptions we give to things that people do, I mean, good things and bad things. I think there is a tendency to personify and to think that there's a spirit of good, a spirit of evil. That implies some kind of a war between them. You can kill evil by having a war against, in this case, evil people, without realizing that that may very well spawn a whole lot of more people who may not necessarily be evil, but who will simply rise up and do things like terrorist acts as a consequence.
So in other words, in addition to these mortal exponents of wicked deeds, there is, as it were, behind the visible and palpable surface, some sort of metaphysical principle which outlasts.
I think that's what they think. Whether directly. I expect Bush actually thinks that literally, and I think Blair kind of subconsciously thinks it, yes.
So you think that this is being an inevitable consequence of a larger religious belief in the existence of metaphysical principles in the universe?
I'm sure it goes with a larger religious belief, whether it stems directly from that religious belief or whether both of them stem from the same kind of mental predisposition, which I dare say all humans have to some extent. I don't know.
But if, as Richard suggests, all human beings share a predisposition to believe, I wanted to know the extent to which he himself might have experienced belief in his early life. After all, I've been talking to many people who, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, identify themselves as atheists or disbelievers, and I was interested in how people arrived at it, or whether they had it from the start. I asked Richard whether he started life, as indeed I had, without a religious thought.
No, I had a normal Anglican upbringing, and I think I first started to doubt it when I woke up to the fact that there were lots of different religions and they couldn't all be right, and it was just an accident, an arbitrary accident, that I happened to have been brought up in the Anglican Church. So that caused me to have doubts, and I sort of became a non-believer at the age of about 9 as a result of that. However, I then reverted to religious belief until the age of about 16.
Okay, well, if I can stop you there
Yes.
and say, I'm very interested in these critical moments.
Yes.
What do you think prompted the reversion to something which you had begun to be doubtful about?
I think it was the argument from design. I think I started to appreciate the glorious complexity, especially of life, and didn't at that time understand the Darwinian explanation for it. And so I think that I did the rather naive thing of assuming that if something looks as though it's designed, it probably is designed, and didn't kind of wake up to the alternative explanation until I was about 16. Also didn't wake up to the fact that even without the Darwinian explanation, design is a very bad explanation for the complexity of life, because it's got a regression built into it. I mean, you have to explain the designer, and so it's not even a good explanation. But finally, I was about 16 when I discovered Darwinism. I was taught Darwinism, and then realized that there is not just an adequate explanation for the complexity of life, but a wonderful, sort of electrifyingly simple explanation, which is the Darwinian evolution.
Now, did it come as a flash of delight, or was there in fact an agonizing sense of regret and remorse at what you had lost?
I don't remember any regret. I think it was delight, and it was a delighted sense of freedom, perhaps, from a view of the world which was always rather unsatisfactory anyway. And it was also delight at the positive feeling that one now had a fully satisfactory explanation of the way the world was, and that I had my life before me to try to understand that in detail.
All right, now if I can go back to that period between 9 and 15. 9 when you first started to have doubts about it because there were so many religions, and 15 when you had as it were, the biological road to Damascus and began to read Darwin. What form did your relatively undoubting religion take? I mean, in the way of observance, in the way of prayer, in one way or another?
Oh, yes. Between 9 and 15, I was pretty devout. I got confirmed. I used to pray. I used to sort of have little fantasies at school, in boarding school, sort of creeping down to the chapel and praying and having sort of visions of angels and things. I remember being prepared for confirmation, which actually, even at the time, I could sort of see that was a load of rubbish. I mean, I sort of forced myself to go on believing in it because here was this vicar in his cassock telling me about it, but it just didn't hang together. It didn't make any sense. I could follow an argument that said the world is such a beautiful place it needs a designer, but that wasn't what it was about at all. It was all about original sin and things like that, which even then I could sort of see wasn't really coherent.
So in a sense then it was more tied to morality and the sense of sinfulness than it was to the beauty of the creation.
I think the preparation for confirmation probably was, yes. Yeah.
I mean, were you constantly told by the minister that you were, in the nature of man, an inheritor of some sin?
I don't remember that. I mean, I do remember odd little stupidities, such as disease is a result of sin. Disease is not a result of bacteria or viruses or cancerous tumours. Disease is a result of sin. And I can remember being told that and hearing other people saying it later on, apparently taking it seriously. I mean, they just didn't sort of seem to realise what an extraordinarily unpleasant as well as illogical thing it is to believe.
So when, at the age of 16, you became acquainted with Darwin, was it because you were taught about Darwin or you began reading The Origin of Species?
No, it was because I was taught.
And were you taught by people who, as it were aware or seemed to be aware of the fact that it would have theological consequences?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that wasn't the terms in which they put it anyway.
How soon in the lessons did you begin to see that it did have theological consequences, that it more or less knocked the idea of design on the head?
I do remember that I understood the principle of Darwinism before I believed it was really big enough to do the job. So I understood the principle of it and realised that, yes, that is a candidate explanation for doing this job, but I still don't think it's a big enough job. And it was only later that I decided, yes, it is a big enough.
Well, in that case, I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to ask you, for the point of view of the viewers, to... It's an awkward question I'm asking you, to give us a summary of the most persuasive version of Darwinian theory.
Right. First, I would make a distinction between the fact of evolution, the actual change from generation to generation that has led from bacterial ancestors to all the creatures that we have today by gradual change, such that you wouldn't have noticed it in any particular generation. That is a matter of fact which can be observed not directly but by its aftermath in the form of fossils and the pattern of living creatures. Then ask, what is the guiding force that led to it being like that? Natural selection. And the most illuminating way I can think of to explain that is that all living things contain digitally coded representations of themselves, digitally coded instructions for building themselves and for making more like themselves. The instructions survive or they don't survive, depending upon how good the bodies are at surviving and how good the bodies are at reproducing and therefore passing them on. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the world becomes filled with coded instructions for being successful in building bodies that survive and reproduce those very same coded instructions.
Now, the objection that is constantly raised by people who hear this, to me and to you, extremely persuasive argument, they say, aha, but what is the source of these fruitful novelties upon which natural selection exerts its pressures? People would say, well, surely the novelties themselves, even if they are then pressure is exerted upon them, something has to explain the novelties themselves.
Yeah. Well, the novelties themselves, of course, are genetic variations in the gene pool, which ultimately come from mutation and more proximally come from sexual recombination. There's nothing very inventive or ingenious about those novelties. I mean, they are random. And they mostly are deleterious. Most mutations are bad. And so you really need to focus on natural selection as the positive side, and it's only natural selection that produces living things which have the illusion of design. The illusion of design does not come from the novelty. It comes from what happens to the novelty as it is filtered through.
But the argument was constantly levelled about the imperceptible changes which might, in fact, as they were developed and recurred, would have culminated in something as useful as a feather. They constantly emphasise the fact, what was it about that early novelty, before it had accumulated to the point where it was recognisably doing an adaptive job, where could natural selection get its purchase upon something which was no more than a pimple?
Yes. Well, it's a fair point, and it's one that I've talked about quite a lot. There cannot have been intermediate stages which were not beneficial. There's no room in natural selection for the sort of foresight argument that says, well, if we got to persist for the next million years and it'll start becoming useful. That doesn't work. There's got to be a selection pressure all the way.
So there isn't a process, as it were, going on in the cells saying, look, be patient.
No.
It's going to be a feather, believe me.
Yes. Sidney Brenner satirised that beautifully when he said he imagined some protein arising in the Cambrian, which was kept because it might come in handy in the Cretaceous. It doesn't happen like that. There's got to be a series of advantages all the way in the feather. If you can't think of one, then that's your problem, not natural selection's problem. Natural selection, well, I suppose that is a sort of matter of faith on my part, since the theory is so coherent and so powerful. You mentioned feathers. I mean, it's perfectly possible that feathers began as sort of fluffy extensions of reptilian scales to act as heat insulators. And so the final perfection of the sort of wing feathers that we see in flying birds might have come very much later, and the earliest feathers might have been a different approach to hairiness among reptiles, keeping them warm. Over and over again, we come across cases where an organ starts out doing one thing and then gets modified to doing another thing. But it's not very useful to challenge an individual biologist's ingenuity in thinking up what particular intermediates might have looked like, because we don't, I mean, maybe we're just not ingenious enough to think what they are. I should have thought there's a more general argument, which is that we shouldn't in any case be saying, oh, I can't think what the explanation for it is, therefore it must have been designed. There's a fatal weakness in any argument which says, I cannot understand how X could have happened, therefore it must have been designed. It would be as if you took a famous scientific discovery. I mean, I think of Hodgkin and Huxley's working out of how the nerve impulse works, a very difficult problem involving very tough mathematics. Suppose that they found it too difficult. Would we have respected them if they'd said something like, I can't work out how this nerve impulse works, Hodgkin, can you? No, Huxley, I can't. Let's just give up and say God did it. It's that element of giving up, it's that element of defeatism, saying, I can't understand how it works, therefore let's fall back on the design explanation.
Yes, even if it doesn't take the form of explicit conscious design on the part of a creator, one of the ideas which seems to me to be the counterpart of what you're saying was the invoking of the vital principle in the 19th century.
I mean, vital principles, force locomotive, none of them explain anything. They're just redescriptions of the problem. But they're pernicious because people think they explain something. It sort of vaguely sounds as though it explains something, and people are so used to the idea that complicated things in our human world are indeed designed and made. But when you've said, oh, it was designed by God, you've explained absolutely nothing, because you're left with the problem of explaining where the designer came from. And so it's a non-explanation. We shouldn't even regard it as a candidate explanation.
Why do you think it was that for really very intelligent biologists to invoke something which we can see now, and it's surprising that they couldn't see then, was such a vacuous explanation as the vital principle to account for the spontaneity of living things?
Well, I suppose it's all very well for us to say we can see that it's nonsense, but when you didn't have anything better, I mean, I could imagine in the time of Hume, for example, he would have said, this is a bad explanation, and he was right. But he didn't actually have a better one to put in its place. And so you have to be quite intellectually courageous to stick on the the philosophical point that it's clearly a bad explanation. And I think that in a real sense it had to wait for Darwin, who produced a deeply satisfying explanation. I mean, it would have been wonderful if Hume would have been simply captivated to have heard Darwin's explanation, I suspect.
For Richard, then, the theory of evolution provided support for his growing disbelief. But I wanted to know why atheism was such a pressing issue for him. Why is this argument so important at this point in the 21st century when you and I can see that it's a settled issue, and yet we find ourselves in an embattled position? And why is the argument so important?
As a scientist, to me it's important because I do regard the hypothesis of a supernatural designer as a scientific hypothesis. I think it's a wrong one, but it actually is science. One can't... I don't have much patience with theologians who say, well, we're really not disagreeing, it's just that religion concerns itself with morality and science concerns itself with the way the universe is, and there's no problem between them. To me, there is a problem, because the moment you talk about a supernatural creator, designer, anything, you are advancing a scientific hypothesis which is either right or wrong. I mean, a universe that has a supernatural intelligence, a supernatural overmind in it, is a very, very different kind of universe from a purely scientific point of view than a universe which hasn't. And it's a very, very interesting difference. I mean, it's a massive difference. And I think it's scientifically interesting to hold a view of the universe which I do, which is that there is no supermind. Well, there may be minds far superior to ours, but they will also have come into existence through a slow, gradual, incremental process. They were not there from the start. People who hold the opposite view, that there was a supernatural intelligence right from the start, responsible for it all, are advancing a very, very diametrically different scientific hypothesis, which has got to be either right or wrong. Even if we can't finally decide whether it's right or wrong, we must at least admit that it is a different hypothesis, very different hypothesis, and therefore it matters.
But I often encounter religious people who argue in the following way. They'll say, well, it's not really, and we don't think of it as a scientific hypothesis. We think of it as something which involves a leap of faith. In other words, that it's not something which they say can be proved right or wrong. There's no way in which it can be proved right or wrong, because it belongs to a domain of existence and entities about which that sort of proof, disproof, and research are irrelevant. There is something which they call the leap of faith, which identifies you with this creator.
Well, that sort of thing just leaves me cold. I mean, I can't really even begin to empathise with it. I understand that it may be in principle impossible to demonstrate one way or the other, so there may be no scientific test you could ever do to decide the question, and that I could believe. But to me, that still leaves the point that it either is true or it isn't. A leap of faith which just means that a person has a sort of internal feeling of revelation which is not shareable with anybody else and which can't be demonstrated to anybody else. To me, that just sounds like a mental delusion.
Why is it then that people actually invoke the notion of a leap of faith, not as a weakness on their part, but as some sort of virtue which is lacking in people like you and me?
Well,
that there is some sort of peculiar willingness, and a willingness which indicates some sort of spiritual generosity, which we somehow don't have.
Well, I mean, first thing, I think it's important to stress, in view of our earlier conversation, that the kind of person you're now talking about is a very much more sophisticated animal than the sort who argues about creationism and that kind of thing, because those people really would think that there was some intervention by the deity in the world. But your people with their internal revelation presumably accept that their God doesn't actually intervene in the world. Otherwise, they would have to concede that it is a scientific hypothesis. So the domain in which he works, or it works, seems to be a rather strangely detached from the world domain, purely concerned with internal feelings that people privately have.
But the implication is that it's a domain from which we are unfortunate enough to be excluded.
That's right.
And that, as I said, that
yes,
it's a lack of some sort of talent, generosity, or blindness on our part, which cuts us off from the beauty and majesty of this domain.
Like not knowing what it's like to fall in love or something.
Yes.
Being deprived, being deficient in some important way. Yes, I mean, I can understand that, and I actually could imagine that we're not so deprived as... I mean, because you and I probably do have feelings that may very well be akin to a kind of mystical wonder when we contemplate the stars, when we contemplate the galaxies, when we contemplate life, the sheer expanse of geological time. I experience, and I expect you experience, internal feelings which sound pretty much like what mystics feel, and they call it God. And I've been called a very religious person for that reason. If I am called a religious person, then my retort to that is, well, you're playing with words, because what the vast majority of people mean by religious is something utterly different from this sort of transcendent mystical experience. What they mean is an entity which interferes in the world, which actually has some kind of impact upon the world and therefore is a scientific hypothesis. The transcendent sense, the transcendent mystic sense that people who are both religious and non-religious, in my usage of the term, is something very, very different. In that sense, I probably am a religious person. You probably are a religious person. But that doesn't mean we think that there is a supernatural being that interferes with the world, that does anything, that manipulates anything, or, by the way, that it's worth praying to or asking forgiveness of sins from, etc.
But once we concede that, I know this is what I call the clergyman in the laurel bushes, that as soon as one makes any concession in the direction of wonder or a sense of majesty and mystery, and it's not confined to the large things, I mean, just simply contemplating mitochondria, or produces the same sort of Blakean feelings that he had from grains of sand. The clergyman in the laurel bushes leaps out and says,
yes,
you are one of us after all.
Exactly, it's happened to me over and over again. I think it's deeply dishonest, and I think it's fooling around with words and not understanding or not honestly dealing with the way ordinary people use words. And so I prefer to use words like religion, like God, in the way that the vast majority of people in the world would understand them, and to reserve a different kind of language for the feeling that we share with possibly your clergyman in the laurel.
But, I mean, as soon as one does admit that, and admits the unknowability of things, there is always the implication from the religious, not necessarily from the orthodox religious, but the people who are susceptible to energies and vibrations and aromas and so forth, to the idea that, well, they often say, there must be something.
Well, okay, I mean, it just doesn't follow. It's just.
Well, my answer to them when they say there must be something, and I always say, well, yes, there is. It's everything.
Yes.
It's there without any super added.
Yes. I mean, I think I would hit back harder than that, actually, and say that the sense of wonder that one gets as a scientist contemplating the cosmos or contemplating mitochondria is actually much grander than anything that you will get by contemplating the traditional objects of religious mysticism.
One of the first people I talked to on making the series on atheism was the Cambridge theologian Dentis Tёrner, whose inaugural lecture on taking up the chair of theology was entitled How to Be an Atheist. Well, as it happens, the conversation we had was never included in the final series, since it turned out to be much more to do with the current relationship between theology and philosophy than it was about the history of disbelief. However, Professor Turner's theological arguments were so interesting and so forceful that I'm pleased now to have the opportunity to show them at their full length. Well, Dennis, I'm reluctant, as you'll see for reasons which we'll discuss, to use the word atheism of myself. I'm reluctant to call myself an atheist, but I get the impression from your inaugural lecture that you feel that us atheists, if I can use that term of ourselves, have somehow, A, missed the target, and also that from the title of your lecture, that atheism is an achievement of some sort, or it's something which one can get good at, and one can do it badly or achieve it badly. Now, I wonder if you could explain to me, first of all, why it is you feel that atheism is something which you have to practice, and practice makes perfect, and we've got it wrong.
Well, I think that you've got to find a way of avoiding a certain kind of question if you're going to be a proper card-carrying atheist. I think one begins to be a theist, to start at that end, when one realises that there's a certain kind of question which gets swept off the agenda. And my point was you have to work quite hard to ensure that question doesn't keep on re-emerging. And that question is the question, why is there anything at all? As distinct from, well, how are things, given that we've got them? And I think it takes quite a lot of work, really, to be sure that your position is secure against that kind of question re-emerging, and I think it just does. Marx once said that each age asks only such questions as it can answer, and it's the cutting back on the agenda of questions which seems to me to be the important issue here. I mean, even more important than the question of whether God exists is the question of what questions are legitimate. And the standard answer to, I suppose, the theistic position in our time is that the question which the name God appears to be some sort of answer to doesn't make sense as a question, gets ruled out. So it's the agenda of questions which is where I would start. And why is it that a culture limits itself to asking, as it were, a set of routine questions which it has handily the methodologies for answering? It's almost as if the methods we've got for answering questions dictate what questions we allow to be asked. And I just think that there's a very troubling question which kind of niggles on the edge of all the other questions.
Well, if we can get back to that bigger and more awkward question, but return for the moment to the card-carrying atheist. Yeah. I always get the impression that the card carriers, and there were more of them, as you say, once than there are now, is it not the case that the reason why there were so many explicit article-writing, card-carrying atheists who, as it were, affirmed their position and recruited people and so forth, people like Bradlaugh, for example, or Annie Besant, and John Stuart Mill, for instance, that the reason why they were so explicitly card-carrying was that they were up against a formal institution which forbade there being a disbelief.
Sure. I mean, those were the days when it was intellectually interesting to be a card-carrying atheist. I think it ceased to be intellectually interesting, which is why I find the likes of a card-carrying atheist like Richard Dawkins to be really just an inverted image of a certain kind of rather narrowed-down theism. There's a sort of fundamentalism about Dawkins' atheism which matches, as in the reversing of a mirror image, that which he's rejected. And it seems to me there's a certain locking of that card-carrying atheist into a fixed form of theism which it opposes, which, if you like, also matches on the atheist side the refusal to ask certain sorts of questions on the theistic side. To give you a practical example, it seems to me that if you suppose that in this world there is a space which must be occupied by evolution, and that whatever space is occupied by evolution, God has to be excluded from, then it doesn't really matter which way around you have it. If you're an evolutionary theorist, you're going to have to exclude God. If you're a theist of the same sort, then you're going to have to exclude evolution. And there's, as it were, an equivalent fundamentalism on either side, which is why I think much more troubling to a theist is the position of indifference than that of militant atheism. Well, your position as distinct from Dawkins, for example.
Now, I want to ask you then, why is it troubling to you that there should be people like myself for whom it's a matter of indifference, to whom, to speak for myself, the question really never occurred. It never entered my mind when I was a child. I heard people using this strange glottally stopped monosyllable and never knew what it was they were talking about.
I prefer a more intellectually exciting life than yours. I mean, I think everything does hang on the question of whether God exists or not. And I think that, on the one hand, I'd like to re-educate some of the card-carrying atheists into what it is they should be denying, as distinct from what it is they do deny. On the other hand, it does seem to me that there are questions which remain to be asked, and I think challenging people to ask them, and asking them why it is that when presented with a question, why is there anything at all rather than nothing, they seem to rule it out as an intelligible or sensible question, or at any rate as a question which doesn't matter. It seems to me that it must matter, though in a rather peculiar sort of way. It's not going to make any difference to how you understand the world if the answer is there must be something which accounts for the fact that there is anything rather than nothing. It accounts for the existence of what there is, not for the kind of world that it is. And I think that as Wittgenstein said, it's not how the world is, but that it is that is the cause of astonishment. And I think I'd just like to try and arouse people to a stronger sense of that astonishment, that there is anything at all. Well, there might not have been.
Well, you see, while I think there is something startling and remarkable about the fact that there is something, and that it never ceases to amaze, and to produce all the feelings which religious people of various denominations say, where do you get your spiritual feelings from? Now, whatever, I hate to use the word spiritual, but the feelings of awe or splendor, or what Freud referred to as oceanic feelings that I get, are as suddenly catching myself out and saying, it's amazing that that my consciousness exists and that my consciousness has content at all. But where I find I differ from you, even in this attenuated, non-idolatrous form of theism, is that if you can ask the question, why is there anything at all, and the answer to that seems to be, there is something which accounts for it, then I find myself, well, why is there God then? Why does the question not go into a series of infinite regresses, asking the question about why the cause of it all, or the bringer about of it all, does not itself, himself or herself, require some sort of
But now you see, you and I are engaged in an argument. I mean, we could have a discussion about that, and a very complex and detailed discussion about it. And it just seems to me that that's where I would want to start, with a sense that there is a problem here. And that there is a problem here at least moves one away from that condition of absolute intellectual indifference to the question of God. There is a fight on now, and it seems to me we're back, as it were, in the days where it mattered what answer one gave to that.
Well,
I haven't answered your question, but I'm simply saying that you're engaging with me on that question is already, in my book, to be doing something called theology.
Why does it have to be called theology rather than an extension of what one would call natural science, which has taken many unpredictable turns to include, for example, a truly unseen world, a world of atoms, which we will never see, and then a world of subatomic particles, field forces and so forth, and indeed degrees of uncertainty, which seem to be mathematically describable. Those themselves are opening up all sorts of possibilities within the sphere of natural science, which doesn't seem to require something beyond as an explanation.
Yes, I'm not sure that it does have to be called theology, and I wouldn't bother about names there, but there is a reason, it seems to me, why it can't just be an extension of natural science. It seems to me that there is all the difference in the world between a question concerning how things are and a question concerning that things are, a question which has to do with the fact that things are, if you see what I mean. Because if you are, as it were, setting that things are against a background of nothingness, then one's beginning to entertain questions about creation. And the classical theistic doctrine of creation is that creation is ex nihilo, out of nothing. Now, it's a curious expression, as Thomas Aquinas pointed out, that nothing isn't a funny kind of something, of any kind. As he said, there isn't a kind of thing that the name nothing names. I mean, there are philosophers who go about as if it did. But Thomas Aquinas was absolutely clear about it. He says, look, it's a very odd sort of making that you're talking about here, because the negation negates the out of. It's a making, but there's no out of going on here.
Yes, but you see, I think one of the things that always worries me about these fathers and these theologians.
I mention them, by the way, so as to prove that I'm not a one-off, because I mean this is classical theism.
No, I know it's been going on a long time, this sort of stuff, but it always seems to me to be rather similar to the rather brilliant piece of improvisation that my friend John Bird did when he played the Frog Footman in my production of Alice in Wonderland, and he improvised rather brilliantly suddenly in the carol mode when Alice is thundering on the door of the Peppercook's kitchen and she can't get in, and he says to you, I'll tell you what I'll do for you. And then she looks at him questioningly, and he says, I'll tell you what I'll do for you. Nothing. That be any good for you? He said, I can't do it straight away because I've got all these things keep propping up. And then he said brilliantly, and in a very Thomistic way, he said, if I was to do nothing for you, I'd have to find the time, see, when I could squeeze it in. Now, there is a beautiful intelligibility about that joke. But the reason why it's a joke is that we know that he's using nothing as if it were something about which we can talk. But then I can't get my mind around the notion of this omnipotent creator existing in this nothingness, who then creates something out of the nothingness or brings something about, leaving the question of why is there a God at all?
Well, I acknowledge the force of your bemusement about that, and of course so do the theologians who say that it couldn't be the case that the God in question was a sort of thing. I mean, the classical theologians say, well, God is not any kind of thing, because if God were a kind of thing, God would just be one of the other kinds of things that there are, only a rather different one. So we're not talking about something that's on the map of creation. We're talking about something which is off the map of creation, which is why what we're talking, how we're talking now, is a kind of bamboozling nonsense, if you like. That's, by the way, called negative theology. That is to say, knowing that you don't know what you're talking about at this stage. And I think that's really what theology is about. It's the sense that on the other side of our language is something which sustains it, which can't be contained within it. And I think this is what Wittgenstein was after at the end of the end of the Tractatus, when he said, well, what underlies how we say things cannot itself be said. Yes. And that's what we call God.
But it could also be claimed that what lies beyond the possibility of being expressed or said is something about which you'd better be silent in order not to talk nonsense. Sure. And you leave it at that, as Russell said when he was arguing with Father Copleston. You simply have to say, well, that's what there is. But it doesn't seem to me that one can press the reiterated child's questions of why, merely because it has a question mark behind it, to an infinity, merely because you can reiterate at will. Reiteration is not necessarily a sign of continuity.
I agree. I mean, I think there is an argument to be had as to whether the question makes sense, or whether it isn't just, as it were, the irritating, childish pressing of a question beyond all possible meaning. And I think there is a case to be made for saying that the question doesn't make sense. But you can't simply say the world is just a fact, there isn't anything more to be said about it, because that's a refusal to discuss whether the question does or doesn't make sense. I just think there is an argument to be had here. And I think having that argument is, as I say, already beginning to do theology.
Well, as you can see from all this, theology, modern or otherwise, can be maddeningly obscure. But what intrigued me, since Dennis had been quite clear in his lecture that anything that went beyond the idea that God was the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is mere idolatry. What intrigued me was how Dennis was able to apply this notion of God to his daily life. You've already given me a position of an extremely attenuated initial state, or a non-initial state, about which there is a legitimate question to be asked. Now, it seems to me that the way you describe it, it is so attenuated, this nothingness, that I find it hard to, see it as being a content of belief, such that it could animate your life, give energy to your moral existence.
Well, here's a sort of soundbite answer. Russell says the world is just simply given. It's a fact. I would say nearly right, but not quite right, because the world is actually gifted. That is to say, it comes, as it were, as a gift of a certain kind.
In other words, it is given in...
It is given in the sense in which there's a giver.
Yes.
And whatever it is accounts for the fact that there is what there is going to be the giver, the creator, the giver, of this. And so existence is a certain kind of gift. I mean, my existence, or anybody's existence, or that there is anything at all, is in the manner of a gift. And of course, one begins to move further in the direction of what I actually believe about things when we make this move from saying the world is simply given to saying that it has been given to us, that there is an author of it. It is, as it were, given to us by a God who... And a further step down that line is that this is not an ironic gift. This is a gift of a good and loving God. Now, there are all sorts of steps that have to be taken to get from that very, very primitive agreement about the Creator up to that sort of point. And there are many obstacles to taking those steps with any degree of confidence. One of them, of course, being the immediate problem, the problem of evil.
Well, let's leave the problem of evil on one side for the moment and talk about the gift and talk about the donor.
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that language being what it is, the notion of donation and gift and giving are inseparable from the recipient.
Yes.
Now, what I would like to know is to whom is the gift donated?
Yes.
Now, the only things that are in a position to be conscious recipients are, in fact, human beings. Now, if this donor is preparing this gigantic box of gifts, why is it that it took so long to create the grateful recipient? Why were there eons of non-recipients?
Sure. Is any other world possible than this world? I mean, one can invent possible worlds. In fact, on some account, some cosmologists' account, all the possible worlds do exist. Indeed, they'd have to exist for this world, which we know of, to be the way it is. I mean, it's one of the ways of trying to explain how come we've got what we've got. But leaving that out of the question for the moment, why not this world? Is any other world?
Well, I have to reply to you in all ignorance that I'm not a good enough physicist or mathematician to be able to, as it were, conceive of alternative arrangements of subatomic particles and so forth. But I'd like to leapfrog backwards a little bit. And it raises a question which I think you wanted to ask, and we can ask it between ourselves. The notion of gift presupposes intention. And one of the things which I find, as someone trained in biology, and I think that Richard Dawkins would say this as well, and certainly Daniel Dennett does, that intentions and so forth don't start to appear in the universe until there are entities which have what Dennet would call interests, maintaining themselves. And these don't start to occur until a very, very late in the history of the universe. And I think that it's really putting the cart before the horse to start invoking intentions on the part of this maker, this gift giver, when intending and having purpose seems to be something which occurs only when you get biological systems which have interests, for which there are purposes of self-maintenance and survival.
Sure. I'm not sure in what way I'd want to get the word purpose in here. I mean, I know there are questions about scientific explanation and how far it does or does not involve purposive concepts. I mean, some read evolutionary theory itself in a quasi-purposive fashion, though Dawkins won't. I think an aesthetic account of what's going on here is better than a purposive one, where what one means by purpose is, well, doing things as means towards certain ends, which are the intentions in question. It's much more to do with, when you ask, well, why does the world exist? It's much more like asking, well, why did Mozart write The Marriage of Figaro? Well, there's a quick answer, and he needed money fast. But a much better answer is because it was just a wonderful exercise of his own creative powers in which there was great joy. And it was a great joy, as it were, to those who performed it and then those who listened to it. So the thing is justified simply in terms of its inherent beauty. Now, I think that does connect with gifts, which, of course, etymologically is connected with the word gratuitous. You're not talking about a purpose for which it exists. It exists simply because that sort of thing is beautiful. Now, to say of a thing that is beautiful is to say why it exists. If you ask, well, why beautiful things, then I think you've already misunderstood what beauty means.
I still felt that I was in the dark, and I simply couldn't understand how it could be that the creation was said to be a performance on God's part, carried out for aesthetic reasons, or how this form of Christianity could become a faith that you could practice in church without it being so simplified that it would become, in Dennis's own words, idolatrous. Well, all right, let me accept your claim as you express it.
Sure.
And really press you to say, in what sense, A, is this a Christian theology? And what does it mean, as it were, on Sunday? How does it construct your, as it were, worship? In what sense do you, outside the daily practices of your life, in those parts of your life which you regard as your religious experiences and your religious actions and religious feelings, what does it do? To whom, for example? To what are prayers directed, or are there such things as prayers in this, by your own admission, attenuated form of non-idolatrous religion?
Well, I mean, quite often I suppose that when I think I'm praying, I am simply talking to myself, a kind of inner dialogue and so on. But there are times when it seems utterly at one's wit's end, and it seems clear that, you are utterly at the mercy of something bigger than you are. I mean, when you're at the wit's end, you're not very big. And it's not hard to find something bigger than you are when you're absolutely at the end of your wits.
But even when you're within your wits, you're constantly, unless you're merely, as it were, going about your business and therefore you're distracted from the largeness of things. What is it that makes the difference between merely saying, what a beautiful sunset, what a vast universe, why am I conscious of anything? How does it differ from those sort of bewilderments and amazements that we all have?
Yes, I mean, I don't really think it does all that much. I mean, if you're looking at it from the point of view of the experienced feel of it, I don't see that there's any difference at all. I just think that sometimes giving it a name can make all the difference in the world.
But then, for the pious atheist, which I would think of myself as, pious in the sense that I have episodes of piety. They're not episodes of piety in which I am bewildered and find myself asking the question of why it is at all, but find myself shaken to the depths of my being that there is anything at all, and by the strange mysteries of the fact that my scrambled egg in the morning is me by the end of the day. Something as negligible as scrambled egg can become something as part of something as considerable as me, or considerable as anyone.
Yeah.
Now, that seems to me to be the most mysterious form of incarnation, much, much grander than what happened in Bethlehem. Now, why do we have to go back to Bethlehem in order to worship the extraordinary majesty of there being anything at all, even without having to invoke an author for it?
Well, you see, I'm not sure that I would actually succeed in getting a merely philosophical argument going, which demonstrated that this fact that there is anything at all is in the way of being a gift of a loving God. I think that that would have to be revealed.
Yes.
To be believed. If only for the reason that there's so much counter-evidence.
Yes. Well, then in that case, I want to ask you the question, for the religious person, in what way and in what manner and what episodes of revelation bring it to your consciousness?
Everything. It's either everything, you see, or simply not true. It couldn't be in just some things. It would have to be that creation is like that. Yeah. And therefore everything has to be brought into the story in some way or other. That is to say, I wouldn't be selective about it. I wouldn't want to go down a line in which I said, well, this reveals God, but of course that doesn't. As if you could explain some things in these terms, but other things didn't fit with it. Because it seems to me that's intellectually dishonest.
It must be comprehensive.
It's got to be the lot. I mean, you've either got to accept that everything in some way or other reveals God, including failure. And that is the most surprising thought, which is why the central part of the Christian story has to do with the way in which failure works within this. If it weren't the case that everything could be included in the picture of what reveals God, including catastrophic failure, the failure of love, the mystery that if you do love, as Herbert McCabe once put it, if you don't love, you're scarcely alive, but if you do love, you'll almost certainly be killed. That's the story of Jesus, it seems to me. Now, that is a totally inclusive story. That is to say, it says, look, the whole lot, everything about it, is in some way or other a revelation of this mystery of love. It's either the case that everything does, or else your position is correct. That none of it needs to. You can look at it in a different kind of way, and you don't need this story at all.
Yes, for me, it is merely the revelation of itself.
Yeah. But you see, I don't think there's any rational argument which would settle the question between you and me. I mean, I think it is a question of faith and whether one can accept it or not at this point. And it seems to me that one is talking about faith precisely at the point where one has gone that step beyond the point where you can have a properly speaking philosophical argument about it. So when you ask me about, well, the content of my belief, we've moved away from that which we can properly dispute, because you either accept my position or you don't.